Seven o'clock? Yes? Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our very last installment of Occupy Valk. We appreciate you all coming. We've had some really interesting discussions all the way through the semester, and tonight we're going to do something that's maybe a little bit different, maybe a little bit shocking. So tonight we're going to talk about education as extermination, most notably focused on American Indian schools. Okay, the cultural interaction and the conflict, right? Cultural interaction and conflict are always subtle and complex processes, right? But they're not always as devastatingly one-sided as is the case of Indigenous and white relations. So historian David Wallace Adams said, and I quote, "The white man's superior technology, hunger for land, and ethnocentrism seemingly knew no bounds. The threat came in many forms: smallpox, missionaries, Conestoga wagons, barbed wire, and smoking locomotives. And in the end, it came in the form of schools." So tonight, we want to start by talking about something that you may think is unrelated, and that is the definition of genocide. Okay, so a lot of you are going to be like, wait a minute, this is not the talk I came for, except it is. So here's the thing, right? In 1944, this man, Raphael Lemkin, he was a Polish and Jewish lawyer who coined the term genocide, right? That word is taken from Greek and Latin roots, and it literally means race killing, okay? Lemkin's original definition of the word was, quote, "any policy undertaken with the intention to dissolve and disappear a targeted human group." Please note that he did not specify mass murder, okay? He does not specify extermination through mass killing, but he talks about any policy that is intended to eliminate a specified human group, okay? So Lemkin said, genocide, is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of actions aimed at the destruction of the essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. So for him, this included the destruction of political and social institutions, culture, language, religion, economic existence, and all forms of liberty, dignity, health, and security, right? So now we've defined what that is, I want to talk about kind of where that, or how that develops over time. So in 1940, in what year? I don't know. After World War II, let's go with that. The United Nations really sought to define and prevent and punish the crime of genocide. Okay, and Lemkin was asked to serve on a committee that was tasked kind of with that commission, right? How do we define it? What does it look like? How do we punish it? In the first year of their work, Lemkin and his committee identified and distinguished three types of genocide, okay? The first was physical genocide, which should be rather self-explanatory, right? That includes the direct and immediate extermination and, quote, slow death measures, okay? So that can include things like lack of proper housing, clothing, food, hygiene, and medical care. But it also included things like excessive work or physical exertion, right? That was likely to debilitate or to kill individuals, to mutilate them, to the use of biological experiments, deprivation of livelihood. All those things were included with physical genocide. The second type is biological genocide. You notice I don't have that up here because this is not really something we're going to discuss tonight, but biological genocide included things like involuntary sterilization, forced abortion, and the separation of the sexes designed to prevent births in a group, okay? And then the last type was cultural genocide. And cultural genocide basically means all policies that are aimed at destroying specific characteristics by which a group identifies themselves, okay? So this includes things like the forced transfer of children from one group to another, forced or systematic exile, prohibition of national language, destruction of books or religious works, destruction of national or religious monuments, or the destruction or dispersion of objects with historical, artistic, or religious value, okay? So when they present it to the United Nations, the UN actually says, well, that's kind of too specific. That makes us nervous. So what happens is the draft that they submit with these 3 types kind of gets watered down. And they will end up publishing in 1948, right, the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Again, it's very watered down. So what I want to do is stick with these 2 types of genocide, physical and cultural genocide, as we talk about Indian boarding schools, okay? So that really is the question for the evening. Did Indian boarding schools serve as an agent of genocide? So I want you to, as we go through this, I want you to kind of keep in mind those definitions, right? Physical and cultural genocide, what they mean. Ask yourself, was the intention here to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group? As we talk about these institutions, as we talk about the methods that they use, kind of keep those definitions in the back of your mind, okay? All right, so we have to start with where this idea comes from, because it doesn't just pop out of nowhere, right? It's not just something that we decide to do with no thought process involved. So the thing that you have to consider is that white Americans make assumptions, especially right during this time. Most Americans saw indigenous peoples, Indians, as they would call them, as savages, yes, because they quote unquote lacked civilization. They believed that civilization was the hallmark of white society. And based on those ideas, right, they look at historical progress and they look at what they would consider to be a doctrine of social evolution. And they basically say, if you look through time, what happens is civilization wins out over savagery, okay? For most Americans, from the founding of the country, understand that what they're looking for, essentially, is a choice for indigenous peoples. And that choice is to embrace civilization or to go extinct, okay? Even policymakers recognize that white settlement had a huge impact on indigenous peoples. They knew that when there were more farms, more settlements, that meant less game, less hunting grounds, all those types of things, all right? And so most white Americans make some assumptions. They believe that different means uncivilized. They believed that the lack of civilization gave them a justification to dispossess indigenous peoples of their land, to take it away. And they believed that one of the ways it would be possible for them to enforce civilization was through education, okay? Even Thomas Jefferson, way back when, right, understood this. He said that Indians had land, but they needed civilization. And white Americans had civilization, but they needed land, okay? And so what he wanted to do was form kind of a relationship with each side giving up what they had. So even from the founding of the country, understand, that we are making assumptions, okay? And all of this kind of comes from this idea that history was a progressive evolution, all right? That man was constantly improving, that progress was always happening. So according to this theory, right, savagism, which is what they will call it, has to give way to civilization. The best example of this is this lovely book right here, okay? So Lewis Henry Morgan writes a book called Ancient Society, or Researches in the Lines of Human Progress from Savagery through Barbarism to Civilization. Woof, that's a title, right? So he writes this in 1877. And what he does is he divides all of history into 7, what he calls ethical periods, okay? Here are his periods, check these out. Lower savagery, middle savagery, upper savagery, lower barbarism, middle barbarism, upper barbarism, and civilization. I think those are hysterical, right? Okay, so here's the thing. How does he rank them? He looks at all of civilization, all these different civilizations, all these different cultures, right? And he ranks them based on a couple of things. He looks at their technical and material development. So what kind of technology do they have? What types of tools do they use? That sort of thing. He looks at their subsistence patterns. How do they live? How do they feed themselves, right? He looks at the complexity of their institutions. How developed is their government, for example? And then he includes a section called Ideas, Passions, and Aspirations, which includes everything from art to religion, okay? And he says, in order to get to this ethical period of civilization, 2 important developments had to take place in a society. First and foremost, you had to have a nuclear monogamous family. Okay, so right there, what does that do to most indigenous societies? Yep, it does not include them, right? Because the majority of indigenous societies are tribal. Yes, they depend on extended families. So right away, he's saying that it's impossible for them to be civilized. And number two, he says that you have to have property ownership. Once again, what does that do to indigenous societies? Do indigenous societies have a mentality of property ownership? No, right? They believe in communal property, right? And arguably not even proper, because most of them believe that all things belong to their equivalent of God, right? Okay, so basically when Lewis Henry Morgan looks at this, he says, okay, here's the deal. Because of these things, no indigenous societies can be considered civilized, right? So he ranks them all, and he says basically they run from upper savagery to lower barbarism, and that's it. So this book was well publicized, right? And it is discussed amongst these groups that are growing at the time, notably reform organizations founded in the 1870s and the 1880s. And these reform organizations were some of the most significant organizations in terms of indigenous rights, okay? These were folks who were calling for a change to policy, who were calling for supportive education in order to cause civilization. And there's a whole bunch of them. I'm going to pick on just a couple. In 1883, for example, the Indian Rights Association is going to be founded. Okay, and their goal was to assimilate and incorporate indigenous people into American life. They believed that it was possible for indigenous people to be assimilated into mainstream American life. So that means property ownership, voting, going to school, all those types of things. Okay, they believed that the only barrier to assimilation was the lack of political will among indigenous people. In other words, they just don't know what they're missing. We got to show them. Okay. You have the Women's National Indian Association, okay? That's formed in 1879, and that organization was a group of non-denominational Christian women who basically devoted themselves to Indian uplift and assimilation. That's what they said. They argued that care of indigenous peoples was part of the domestic sphere, that it was women's responsibility because they're supposed to be taking care of everybody, okay? They were particularly focused on education. One of the things they're going to do is they're going to publish pamphlets. They're going to help to stock Indian school libraries with books. They're going to get very involved. They even published their own magazine called The Indian's Friend in 1888. Okay. So you have a whole bunch of these groups, and what they start to do in the 1880s is they start to have these conferences. So they hold these conferences at a place called Lake Mohonk. Yeah, I honestly don't know, but that's what it's called. Okay, so they have this meeting of reformers to discuss what they call the Indian question. This was the brainchild of a man named Albert K. Smiley, who was a Quaker and a Bureau of Indian Commissioners member, okay? And he basically says, we're gonna be friends to the indigenous people. We're gonna find ways to uplift them. And one of the ways we're gonna do that is focus on conversion, right? That we have a Christian obligation to bring the word of God to them. And we're also going to focus, right, on the idea of creating good citizens. So what that means, right, for most people at the time is to teach them about voting, to teach them about property ownership. Again, to kind of go back to that idea of civilization, to teach them about the hallmarks of civilization, okay? These conferences go on for like 30 years. Every year they get together and they talk. Okay, so what they decide, right, is fundamentally that education is the thing that will allow indigenous peoples to assimilate. So they're going to look at education as this civilizing force, right? And they're going to kind of see this process in terms of teaching indigenous peoples about the knowledge and the values and the mores and the habits of Christian civilization, because understand that when they talk about civilization, it cannot exist without Christianity. Okay. All right. So there is this belief that education causes assimilation, and they're going to teach them things like Republican virtues, democratic freedoms, right? They're going to promote individual opportunity. So individualism over the whole, right? Over communalism. They're going to focus on prosperity, and they choose education for a couple of reasons. They had tried assimilation in various ways. So for example, right, in the 1880s, we're going to see the passage of this thing called the Dawes Act, which took reservations and broke them up into individual plots of land, right? And basically every head of family gets a plot of land. And the idea was we're going to teach them how to be farmers, except we didn't do any teaching. We just said, here's a bunch of land, do whatever, right? That also undermines the foundation of the family, because again, if you're focused on extended family and now you have a singular head of household, you're trying to drive that mentality of a nuclear monogamous family. That doesn't work. They will try the passage of laws where they are going to focus instead, right, on enforcing civilization. So they will outlaw certain religious practices from indigenous groups. They will make certain crimes, capital crimes, punishable by the government. Those things also don't work. Education seems to be a better choice. First and foremost, it's easier to train children than adults. Yes, that's definitely true, right? They argued basically the older generation was incapable of being civilized. They were a waste of time. So let's focus on the children instead, right? They also believed that if you started with kids, it would speed up the process of assimilation. It would cause them to evolve culturally, okay? And they said there's economic benefits to this because let's be honest, education, not super expensive. And over time, the argument becomes that if we educate these kids, then what we're going to do is we're going to make them economically viable. They're going to be employable. They're going to be able to go out and get jobs that will reduce their dependence on the government in terms of things like rations. So all of this, right, is focused on this idea that if we get them young enough, we can kind of indoctrinate them. Heard that word before? Yes, tossed around about education a lot lately. You betcha. Okay, so the basic aims of education are 5. Okay. With these Indian schools, the idea here was to focus on a couple of things. First and foremost, the rudiments of academics. How to read, write, and speak English. Sort of necessary, right? And if you're going to participate in the wider democracy. They're going to focus on introducing what they call the civilized branches of knowledge, math, science, history, although that's kind of questionable, and arts, right? They also want, number 2, to focus on teaching them how to work. Now understand that our mentality of work comes from that whole Protestant work ethic thing, right? That idea that yes, you keep your hands busy all the time, that the more you work, the more successful you will be. It's important for us to have individual wealth, yes? Okay, understand that indigenous peoples don't have that same conception. And so one of the things that education is hoping to teach them is how to work, right? Teach them practical skills, practical trades, things like carpentry and that sort of thing, okay? Number 3, they want to focus on quote unquote proper gender roles because indigenous people's gender roles are different than white society. They want the girls to grow up and be homemakers, to raise their babies, to have proper little Victorian houses, right? Where everything is white and clean all the time. No, it's not, but they want to say that, right? Okay, so they're going to teach them proper gender roles. That means that if the female is going to be the stay-at-home person, then the guy, right, the husband, needs to be the wage earner, the farmer, the man who supports the family. Okay, so they're going to reinforce kind of those traditional gender roles. Again, focused on that nuclear monogamous family. Okay. Number 4, once again, we're going to focus on Christianization because civilization cannot exist, according to these folks, right, without belief in God, most specifically in Jesus and God. Okay, so we're going to make them responsible for their own salvation, if you will. And then last, they're going to focus on citizenship training. This is where they're going to talk about what actually happens in a democracy, right? So these fundamental principles of democratic government, they want to instill a deep devotion to the country, to the flag, to democracy inside of these students. They argue that by studying American history, they would internalize all of these stories that we tell ourselves, all of these national myths, if you will, that justify the expansion of the American empire to the detriment of indigenous people. Okay, so we're looking at 5 basic ways that we're going to do this. And they start this in a very interesting way because They don't start with the boarding schools that we're actually going to talk about tonight. In fact, early attempts were actually day schools. Okay, so when we talk about a day school, understand that these are schools located on the outskirts of reservations. They focus on language, reading, writing, right? And then some industrial training. How to use tools, how to use saws, how to use hammers. If you're a boy, if you're a girl, they're going to focus on proper meal preparation and sewing and that sort of stuff. Okay. Now, there were advantages to this. It's cheap, right? Relatively inexpensive. Parents don't oppose it because your kids are still under your control, right? They're so close to you. Kids could take, in theory, that knowledge back to their parents. So in theory, the day school is beneficial because not only are you assimilating those kids, but you're then taking that assimilation back to parents. However, there are some big disadvantages here. First and foremost, absenteeism was a big problem, right? Like if your family decides to go hunting, you just don't go to school and it's fine, right? So absenteeism is going to be a problem. Also consider that in a lot of ways, day schools are not very effective at assimilation because you only get them for 2, 3, 4 hours a day, and the rest of the day is spent with their family, with their tribe, right? So even if you manage to convince them of the benefits of what you're teaching, once they go home, those things maybe aren't as important, okay? So when that doesn't work very well, they start to talk about the fact that, you know, one of the ways we can actually assimilate kids is to make sure that we have greater control over them. And so they started to use what were called on-reservation boarding schools, okay? So the idea here is to continue that education, to minimize the influence of their parents, right? Essentially by taking these kids and having them board, having them live at a school on the reservation, okay? So it's located at the agency headquarters. Students stay at the school usually for like 8 to 9 months out of the year. They're still doing like half academic, half industrial training. So still reading, writing, math skills, and then some industrial training, carpentry, whatever, right? So there are advantages here. They do get more time. That matters a lot, right? Because assimilation, of course, is a process. So the more time you get, the more impact you're likely to have, right? So there are some advantages there. In addition to that, they could also expand their industrial training. So one of the things that on-reservation boarding schools will do is they will focus on farming and livestock care because they can, right? A little bit bigger rather than a day school. Also, that knowledge could still be taken back to parents because you did get breaks and you did get vacations, and they do send you back to live with your family. Disadvantages here is that you're still connected to your family. Because consider, right, that your parents know where you are. Yes, you're relatively close. So anytime they would come to the agency headquarters to get rations, for example, they would try to come and visit you. And the leadership in terms of the on-reservation boarding schools would be like, well, that doesn't work. We're trying to minimize this relationship, but if they keep showing up all the time, that's going to be bad, right? So basically they said, you're going to cause these students to relapse back into savagery, right? If you allow them lots of access to their parents. P.P. Wilcox, who was the agent to the San Carlos Apache, said, quote, wow, I cannot read. That's good. Okay. The reservation, no school can be conducted as to remove children from the influence of the idle and vicious who are everywhere present. Only by removing them beyond the reach of this influence can they be benefited by the teaching of the schoolmaster. In other words, the only way we're going to be successful is if we take these kids away, if we remove them from the influences of their family. And so that is what gives way to, well, a very different approach. Okay, so there's this guy. His name is, Richard Henry Pratt, okay? And Richard Henry Pratt was a veteran of the Civil War. He, after the Civil War, tries to go back to like regular life and discovers he doesn't really like it. So he joins with the regular army in 1867. He's commissioned as a second lieutenant. They put him in charge of an all-black army unit that had a group of Cherokee scouts. And then he spends 8 years off in the West fighting indigenous people, okay? He's quote unquote keeping the peace in the West. But in 1875, he was charged, given the job, of overseeing the incarceration of 72 indigenous warriors, prisoners, Okay, most of those prisoners were in their 20s and their 30s. So he is told that he's going to take them down to St. Augustine, Florida, where he is going to incarcerate them at Fort Marion. And the thing is, Pratt's in charge. He has no direct supervisor. He can pretty much do whatever he wants. And Pratt decides that he wants to try something. And so he decides to turn his prison into what he calls a school for teaching civilization. Okay. So his years spent in the West had really convinced him that the only possible way to save Indigenous people from being obliterated by white progress was to educate them. So he says, all right, we're going to turn this into school. He goes out and he hires a bunch of teachers, right? Most notably a young lady, well, not so young, a retired teacher named Miss Sarah Mather, who had formerly run a girls' boarding school. She's a very devout Christian. And he says, come on, we're going to try this little experiment. Okay. And so what he decides to do is he decides to use kind of like military discipline combined with an education program. So all of the inmates are going to be dressed in uniforms. Their hair is going to be cut and they're going to be subject to military discipline. Lots of marching, lots of regimentation, all that type of stuff. But he also focused on education. So they will teach them English, how to write it, how to read it, how to speak it, right? In addition to that, he says you need some skills because you have to be able to do something in the community. So he wants to promote this idea of economic individualism, that you, right, need to be able to support yourself. The larger community is not your problem, just yourself. So they are going to put them to work. Now they're going to pay them, I should point that out. They will pay them for their labor, but they're going to farm them out to all kinds of places, right? They actually even established savings accounts. So when you got paid, right, you were working to save your money, not just spend it. All right, so what do, right? We teach them all kinds of skills, mostly industrial skills, focused on things like tinsmithing and bridle making and all that kind of stuff. And he teaches them all these skills. And then actually he works with the local community, St. Augustine, to send them out into the community. He hires them out to businesses. He also encourages them to go attend church, right, and to get involved in the community. His idea being that not only will it help them practice their skills, practice their English, but in addition to that, it will help to break down discrimination against Indigenous peoples. Okay, so over the next 3 years, this is what he does. And honestly, it appears to work because they do get involved in the community and they do, right, employ themselves. They work really hard. And Pratt says, wow, this really works. So in 1878, he's told that the prisoners can be released. He's like, oh, well, now what? So he decides, right, to, first of all, talk to the guys who've been incarcerated, and secondly, to pursue this idea of education further. All right. So he goes to the guys that he's had incarcerated and he says, hey, what do you guys want to do? Right? Do you guys want to go ahead and go home, or do you want to continue your education? And 22 of them say they want to continue. So now he's got to find a place for them. And what he does is he contacts Samuel Chapman Armstrong, who's in charge of the Hampton Institute. Does anybody know what the Hampton Institute is real famous for? You guys know who Booker T. Washington was? That's where he's educated. Okay, so the Hampton Institute was an organization dedicated to the education of former slaves. And so he goes to Samuel Chapman Armstrong and says, hey, I've got these 22 Indigenous people who want to continue their education. Would you be willing, right, to host them? And kind of shockingly, Armstrong says yes. So they go to the Hampton Institute and they're basically trying to work on ways to create an Indian boarding school. But Pratt says, you know, these guys are like in their 20s and 30s, and you guys are kind of focused on college. We really need to think about this in terms of younger ages. So what Pratt does is he goes to Washington to lobby for his own residential school, and he gets approval and funding and a location. And so the result of that is going to be this thing called the Carlisle Indian Institute. So the Carlisle Indian Industrial School is going to be like the prototype boarding school, okay? He needs a couple of things. He needs some students, as you might imagine, and he needs some staff. So he very quickly puts together a staff, and then he goes out and he starts to recruit students. He focuses primarily on the Pine Ridge and Rosebud reservations in the Dakota Territory. And with a lot of persuasion, and some would say harassment, he recruits a total of 98 boys and 38 girls for Carlisle's first class. Okay. I should point out that all of these children for that first class are going to go with the blessing of their parents and their elders. That will not be the case later on, but in this instance, that is true. So Pratt secures funding and staff and students, right? And then he also starts to establish basically the theory and the practice of boarding schools. His theory is that assimilation works best when you are completely immersed in the other culture. So he says basically indigenous people are inferior to whites. So that inferiority is the result of a lack of access. He really honestly believes in kind of like that tabula rasa mentality, that blank slate mentality, where all people are blank slates when they are born. Yeah. So he says, right, people aren't inevitably savage or inevitably uncivilized. It's just they're products of their surroundings, products of their culture. So he says by immersing children into this assimilative process, then they would become civilized. So consider then what Pratt is saying, right? He is saying that inferiority was based on education, not on race. It was based on culture, not on race. That being said, he also saw this as a war. When he was denied a request for additional regiment officers to help him at Carlisle, he complained to the president. He said, I am at this time fighting a greater number of enemies of civilization than the whole of my regiment put together. And I know further that I am fighting with them 1,000 times more hopes of success. In other words, the army's great, but education is better. Okay. He was critical of the existing system. He doesn't like the Dawes Act that splits up the reservations. He is actually anti-reservation. He says you're isolating them and not allowing them to assimilate into society. So he argued that this new school was going to force assimilation through removal and isolation from tribes and family, that it was going to ensure incorporation into the community, okay, through the outing system, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And he believed that the purpose of education was quite literally to kill the Indian to save the man. In other words, the only way you're going to survive, right, is if we civilize you into white society. Okay, so here's the thing. Carlisle takes off, but it's not just Carlisle. Because consider that even when Carlisle is new, so in 1880, right, it's been around for like a year, give or take. When that happens and he starts to recruit students, the perceived success encourages Congress to expand this even more, right? Policymakers say, wow, there's a strong possibility that this is going to work. So we start to see a push from reform organizations and from Congress to open additional boarding schools. So if you look on the right, you can kind of see the list, right, of where they're located. Understand these are going to be called off-reservation boarding schools because they are not near the reservation. You will notice, right, that number one, Carlisle is located over here in Pennsylvania. Everybody see that? Okay, but where are the rest of them located? Further west indeed. Here's the thing. Actually, Pratt hated that a lot because Pratt believed that immersion had to be into a completed civilized society, and basically says the West, they're not civilized enough. But Congress says, oh, it's cheaper to put them out there. So that's what they're going to do. Okay. So if you look at this, right, I want you to consider where we're building. Oregon, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, New Mexico, Colorado, again, South Dakota, Arizona, Montana, all these different places, right? And so eventually there will be 25 off-reservation boarding schools. Now, again, understand that at the core of all of this is the widely accepted notion that Indian children had to be physically removed, needed to be removed from their homes in order to force assimilation. Okay, that piece is really, really important. So we can also see this as illustrated by the amount of money and the enrollment. So if you look at 1877, the federal expenditure for off-reservation boarding schools is $20,000. 23 years later, how much is it? 23 years later would be 1900. What's the expenditure? Almost $3 million. That's a big step up, wouldn't you say? Also look at the enrollment. In 1877, we're looking at 3,598. And what's the enrollment by the time that we get to 1900? 21,568. That is what? 700% increase. We're dedicated to this idea without question, right? We are definitely going to take off on this. Okay, so when we talk about residential boarding schools, we can kind of talk about some general practices that are all the same. All right, it doesn't really matter where you go. The process is very similar because, again, understand that most of them are based off the same principles as Carlisle. So when we talk about residential boarding schools, right, understand that this represents a wholesale life change for Indigenous children. The experience for every child obviously is going to be different, right? Factors like your cultural origin, the school's location, your age, previous experience with schooling, all that stuff is going to impact how this affects you. But we can talk about some of the common practices that happen here, okay? So I want to start with arrival, because arriving at school is a very traumatic thing for a lot of folks. Policymakers believed that the civilization process required essentially an assault on your Indigenous cultural identity. You had to strip these children of all of their ties to civilization or to their culture, right? To their tribal ways. In other words, you have to remove the savage elements. That's how they will refer to it. So on arrival, first thing that's going to happen to you is a bath. That doesn't sound terrible, right? Like, baths are nice. We all like baths. But consider a couple of things. First and foremost, yes, they are scrubbing away the dirt of the journey. Yeah. But also, they saw this as a way to kind of ritualistically scrub away the filth of savagery. There are stories of them including lye. You guys know what lye is? Like a super caustic cleaning agent. There are stories of them including lye in the water as they bathed you. There's all kinds of like horror stories that come out of this, right? In addition to that, once you have a bath, if you are a male, you're going to have your hair cut. And that might not sound like a big deal, but understand that it is in terms of your tribal identity. The majority of Indigenous tribes only cut their hair when they are in mourning, right? When someone dies. So this is an easy way to symbolize a wholesale change, but at the same time, understand what that's communicating to that Indigenous child, right? That we're communicating that you are now mourning essentially the loss of your family, your tribe. Okay. Clothing, all of it's going to be replaced, and you're going to wear things that are horrible on so many levels. Let's talk about wool suits. Ew, right? Scratchy, itchy, uncomfortable compared to what you're used to wearing. You're going to have to wear hard-soled shoes when a lot of tribes either don't wear shoes, right, or use moccasins, something that's soft-bottomed. All of your tribal clothing is going to be taken away and replaced with uniforms. Because again, remember, we're assimilating you into white society. Okay. What else? Oh, name replacement. Let's talk about that a little bit, right? So understand that the majority of teachers at Indian schools believed that Indigenous names were unpronounceable and savage. So they're going to replace your name with something Christianized, right? First and last names, right, are going to be attached to you. You have to learn them immediately. Right, this is not like a process. This is something that is expected of you. But I also want you to think about what that does to your mental health. Your name is part of your identity, correct? So if someone tells you you are no longer, if somebody tells me I'm no longer Dana and tells me my name is now Karen, no, please. You know what I'm saying? But like that has a significant impact on your psyche. They are taking away part of your identity, okay? What else? Food is going to be markedly different. Yes, there are no forms of traditional food available. Most of the diet's going to focus on bread and grains, vegetables and fruit when they're available. Most of the time, kids at Indian boarding schools, they are going to drink water and coffee, not milk, which is ironic because a lot of them have dairies, but that's fine. It's okay. Also, you're expected to practice middle-class table manners. You have to know how to use a fork, how to use a knife, how to use a spoon, how to use a napkin, not to spill on the tablecloth, all those things, right? The other thing that is going to be a huge barrier is that all native languages were banned. You were not allowed to speak your indigenous language ever. If you did, you were punished. Please understand that, okay? Now, I want you to think about how hard that's going to be. If someone picked you up and dropped you in, like, I don't know, let's say Afghanistan, are you going to be able to communicate? Do we have similar patterns of speech? Do we have similar cultural experiences? No. And so essentially what's going to happen here, right, is these kids are going to feel incredibly isolated because they can't communicate. Now, will they learn English pretty quickly? Yes, because they have no choices. But also understand what that does, again, to your identity, right? That you're stripping away language, you're stripping away parts of who you are and where you come from. Okay. Then we should talk about curriculum. All of these schools are going to be militaristically regimented. There is marching, there are bells for everything, a bell to wake up, a bell to call you to breakfast, a bell to send you to work, to class, whatever, right? Everything is militarily regimented. Sleeping times, waking times, take your pick, right? They scheduled those lives on purpose to break tribal practices. They want all of these kids to learn what clock time is rather than natural time, which is what most indigenous people use, right? Looking at the sun, kind of mentality of what happens during the day, not a clock. You're going to have academic study, right, at boarding schools. You're going to be taught, again, math, geography, the study of nature, that sort of thing. U.S. history. Anybody want to guess how many hours a day you actually get academic instruction? 2 hours a day for academic instruction. The next 2 hours are spent with religious instruction, because again, consider, right, that you can't have civilization without Christianity. That's going to be part and parcel of the experience at boarding schools. And then the rest of your time is going to be focused on industrial skills and creating that work ethic, okay? So when we talk about this, understand that, again, creating that work ethic is part and parcel of breaking your connection to your indigenous culture, okay? The goal here was to foster an acceptance of individualism, not communalism, that I have to be successful, not everybody, right? So skills are taught in a gender appropriate manner, as I mentioned. Boys are taught a variety of skills: farming, livestock care, tinsmithing, bridle making, take your pick, all kinds of industrial skills, right? Girls are taught sewing and cooking and canning and ironing and childcare, because those things are important. And then once you got to a certain point in your education, they utilized this thing called the outing system, where essentially they would farm you out as paid labor to local families or farms or businesses, okay? So most people get to stay with like a middle-class farm family where they learn how to apply their knowledge. Some will be sent into urban settings where they go to work in industrial factories to show off their skills, right? But this outing system further separates you. Please understand that, because now not only do you not have your family, but you also don't have those friends, right, that you have identified and grown close with at school. Okay, so if I stopped there, you would be like, okay, that's not so bad, right? If I just stopped there, like, yes, it's terrible if they take you away, but let me point out that there are some additional things we should talk about. Let's talk about recruitment versus compulsory education. So if you remember, I said that first class that went to Carlisle, they were recruited, right? They went with the blessing of their family. So in the beginning, you have agents of the school who go to the reservation, and they would convince your parents, convince your tribal elders to send you. This young man over here is Luther standing there. He is going to go willingly with the blessing of his father. Often, however, participation in boarding schools was forced. And when I say forced, I don't just mean like under extreme caution. I mean through the military or the police, okay? Parental opposition was kind of fierce. Can you imagine why? Somebody wants to come and take your child and send them hundreds of miles away. Are you going to pitch a fit? Probably. Parents did. And when recruitment and persuasion failed, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was authorized by Congress to basically use whatever means were necessary to compel them to send their children. They could withhold rations from your tribe, meaning you have no food. They could send in the police to round up your kids. They could also send in the army to round up your kids. So most famously, this lovely school right here is Fort Hall Boarding School. And Fort Hall Boarding School in Idaho had room for 200 students, but they only had 62. Okay, so what they decided to do was go kind of force the issue. So in 1897, when they can't secure enough kids to fill up the school, they request cavalry to come in and forcibly take the kids at gunpoint, which they do. At the end of that process, Fort Hall has 207 children enrolled, thanks to the intervention of the US military. Okay. In 1911, a group of Hopis decided that they didn't want to send their kids, and in fairness, they did so for a good reason. They had had a measles epidemic, and something like half of the children in the tribe had died. So they didn't want to send their kids off to boarding school, but once again, the military shows up. They actually hid their kids. They hid 51 boys and 18 girls. Think about what I just said. They hid them. They hid them in caves. They hid them in baskets of corn, trying to keep them away from the military. They are, however, rounded up, and all of their fathers were then arrested and sent to Alcatraz Island, a prison. Okay, so that's maybe not so great. Let's also talk about creating work ethic versus forced labor. So yes, work ethics are nice, right? It's nice when people want to work. We collectively as a society like the Protestant work ethic, right? However, also consider that what you have here is captive labor, okay? So you have students doing lots and lots of different things. Boys as young as 10 are going to be forced to work in manufacturing commercial wares. Girls are going to be forced to sew, right? Lots and lots and lots of things. So I want you to think about this lovely little chart that I've got over here. In 1881 at Carlisle Industrial Indian School, the students created all of these things. 8,929 metal items, 183 double harnesses, 161 bridles, 9 spring wagons, and 2 carriages. That's a lot, right? Do you want to know the value of that on the open market? $6,300. And all of that money, where does it go? Back to the school. It doesn't go to the children. It does not go to improve their living conditions. It goes back into the school. If we look at Albuquerque in 1891, okay, read all these things. Dresses, chemises, hickory shirts, boys' waist, pairs of underwear, see all that? I want to point out that all of those things were made by 16 girls. 16 girls made all of those things in a singular year. And then they sold them on the open market. Where does the money go? Back into the school pocket. In Genoa, which is in Nebraska, I don't have that one up there, they had 300 acres under production. They sold corn, oats, wheat, potatoes, and sorghum, all at market for in excess of $14,000. At Haskell, which down there, which is in Kansas, they are going to have 600 acres under cultivation, all worked by students, and they are going to sell all of those farm products, right? Hay, wheat, oats, corn, and potatoes, to the tune of $48,467. Okay, on top of that, at Haskell, they also had a bakery and they had a laundry. The bakery, check this out, in 1 week, 12 boys working in the bakery, they produced 2,000 loaves of bread, 2,000 buns, 900 cinnamon rolls, 220 pies, 900 cookies, 900 slices of gingerbread and cake, and 1,800 pieces of cornbread in a week. That is not fed to the residents of the school. It is sold in the local town. Okay, so here's the thing. Do you have a choice to work? No, it's part of your education. Are you benefiting from that? Well, kind of. I should point out, they do pay you. If you had 0 to 2 years of experience, you know how much you got paid? Anybody want to guess? Say again.
2 cents.
Good guess. Not right. 1 cent. 1 cent per hour is what you got paid. Okay. If you had 2 to 3 years of experience, you got a raise, 1.5 cents an hour. And if you had more than 3 years of experience, you got 3 cents an hour. 3 cents an hour. Okay, now take that and think about this. How many hours are we talking about here? Right? Hours and hours of labor. Again, do you have a choice? No. Is this forced labor? Yes. In 1935, a Bureau of Indian Affairs employee, a guy named Oliver Lafarge, described the boarding school system as being composed of penal institutions where little children were sentenced to hard labor for a term of years for the crime of being born to their mothers. In other words, he's going to compare it to the convict leasing system in the South, arguing that essentially, right, this is captive forced labor. Okay, how about this? Let's talk about punishment, disease, and death. Corporal punishment, right, in terms of like beatings, spankings, that sort of thing, was not really a thing for most indigenous cultures. It is well used in boarding schools, okay? When we talk about that, understand there's a whole lot going on there. Parents, right, did not in any way, shape, or form support the idea of corporal punishment, but it's used. There are tons of stories, right, of kids being strapped. There's one story where the matron has all of the girls in the dormitory lay down on their beds, right, face down, and then she goes down the rows and straps them and whips them with a long piece of leather cord as punishment for a variety of things, including speaking their indigenous language, okay? On top of that, we're gonna have constant issues with hunger. If you notice, I said we're producing all this stuff, but none of it is going back to the kids, right? So let me give you some numbers that I always find really interesting, okay? In 1928, there's a government report that goes out and they study what's happening at indigenous schools. And they found that on average, Indian schools were spending 9 cents a day, 9 cents a day to feed an indigenous child. That's $32.85 a year, okay? If you want to compare that to a white child in a residential boarding school, anybody want to guess what they're spending? On average, $400 a year to feed them. So $32.85, if you want to be specific, to $400. What does that suggest to you about hunger? Is it ever present in terms of these kids in indigenous schools? You betcha, right? Most children on average subsisted on less than 1,500 calories a day at boarding schools. Okay, so we've got corporal punishment, lots of abuse, lots of neglect. We have not really had a reckoning with that in any way, shape, or form. Canada's starting to. We're not there yet. We don't know enough. And there's also some distinctions, but there's a lot of that, right? There's lots of forms of punishment. You could be locked in the guardhouse. If you were a boy, you could be forced to march around the school grounds in girls' clothing. That was intended to be degrading, right? Most commonly, it's the use of the strap. It's the whipping, okay? On top of that, please understand that disease is endemic. It's everywhere. Tuberculosis, trachoma. You guys know what trachoma is? I did not know. I had to look it up. So this is trachoma. It's an eye disease, right? So here's your normal eye. If you get trachoma, you get inflammation and then your eyelid scars. And then eventually what happens is your corneas cloud over. In other words, it's causing partial blindness. Trachoma is everywhere. It's highly, highly communicable. Tuberculosis is the other big one that's going to spread throughout these dormitories. Consider that they don't do much in terms of sanitation. They don't do much in terms of preventing any type of spread, right? Every school, every boarding school has its own graveyard where they buried the children who died there, okay? In 1899, a Bureau of Indian Affairs inspector, his name is William McConnell, openly denounced the entirety of the residential education system. He said, "The word murder is a terrible word, but we are little less than murderers if we follow the course we are now following. Hundreds of boys and girls are sent home to die so that a sickly sentiment may be patronized." Because here's the thing, when you died at school, you were buried there, but a lot of times when you get sick, they will send you home first so that they don't have to count you among their number, right? In 1908, a Smithsonian study, they went out and studied 5 reservations, and they found that 80% of the population had some form of symptom of tuberculosis. So we're seeing this massive spread, right? That, of course, causes death in lots of numbers. My favorite example, I don't know if it's my favorite one, a good example of that is Wind River. And in Wind River, they sent 73 kids to school, 26 of them survived. Now, all that to be said, I don't want you to think that nobody does anything about it. There's resistance. There's passive resistance, right? There is giving nasty nicknames to your teacher. And there is, there are things like refusing to participate in activities, all those kinds of things. They will work slowly. But there's also acts of cultural preservation. Sneaking off to go hunting and fishing on the weekend when there's some quote unquote free time, right? Creating dolls or teepees to kind of live out what you think is happening at home. They find ways to actively resist. They set schools on fire a lot because they can, right? They destroy school property. They also confront the people who are holding them, So there's all kinds of ways, right, that resistance persists. But again, understand where we're coming from here. They run away, right? There's lots of instances where children run away because their choices, they would rather go home or die trying. So we've got all of these forms of resistance. So this picture, I don't know, does anybody know what this is? This is something called gypsum weed. There's a really great story that I don't have time to tell. But basically a bunch of girls decided they're ticked off at their matron because she's really mean. So they go and they eat some gypsum weed and it causes hallucinations. And so like in the middle of lunch, they're like chasing imaginary mice around the room. And she's like, what is going on? Because she doesn't know, right? All kinds of fun things. Okay, so here's the thing, right? When we consider all of this, when students leave those boarding schools, understand that they're kind of stuck in this personal tug of war. They got to make decisions, right? Are you going to stay, quote unquote, civilized? Are you going to stay, loyal to the things that you were taught in school? Or are you going to reject everything that you were taught and go back to your original culture, go back to your family, go back to your tribe? That's a really hard thing. If you have spent 8, 9 years at a boarding school, you have been taught all of these things, and then you get home and it doesn't always match up, right? So when it doesn't match up, what do? Well, sometimes you reject everything that you know, and it's hard to come back because there's a chasm of knowledge there. Your experiences don't match up with your contemporaries' experiences. They have had instruction in indigenous religion. They have had instruction in ways of life that you haven't had. And so you're playing catch up a lot of the time. So there's a lot of issues there, right? In terms of how do you bridge that chasm of knowledge? People are happy to see you, but also consider that your daily life doesn't look anything like their daily life. And so the conflict there is going to be significant. Things like, what do we eat? How do we cook it? Do we boil water before we wash our laundry? Like dumb things like that don't seem like a big deal. But in average everyday life where you have two cultures trying to merge together, that is a really hard thing, okay? Some of them are going to choose to reject civilization entirely. Others are going to choose to kind of live a middle path, right? Others will reject their families and choose to live in white society, where ironically, they are not accepted either. Okay, so let's go back to the original question. Remember types of genocide: physical genocide, cultural genocide. So here's the question: did boarding schools do this? Were they agents of physical genocide? Were they agents of cultural genocide? What examples go where? This is where you tell me. Yeah.
Like the arrival would definitely go under cultural genocide.
Yep.
And then the forced labor with physical.
Yep. What else? How about religion? Where does religion go? Cultural, right? Because again, we're focused on eliminating that practice that is endemic to your tribe and replacing it with something else. Okay. I want to point out that even the US government, as early as 1928, says, yeah, we know this is terrible. In January of 1928, they put out this thing called the Merriam Report, and the Merriam Report castigates Indian schools. What it says is, you guys are terrible, right? It points out you do nothing to stop the spread of pandemics, right? You don't do anything to deal with illness. Your education system doesn't work. And it's a horrible thing that we are separating our kids from their families. So even in 1928, there's recognition. All right. So in conclusion, I'm a little bit long, sorry. A couple of things I want to say in terms of conclusions. First and foremost, Indian boarding schools are indeed, right, agents of genocide, both physical and cultural genocide without a doubt. But the second thing that I want to point out here in terms of conclusions is that we have to ask ourselves now how we as Americans kind of contend with this difficult history. Arguably to date, we have not. We have not dealt with it. Not really. Now, that being said, in July of this year, Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, announced a comprehensive review of American Indian boarding schools. That is very important work, right? And it's just one more example of why history matters, always. If we're going to grow as a nation, if we're going to rectify the wrongs of the past, the first thing we have to do, obviously, is acknowledge that it happened, right? Once we acknowledge it, then fully and out in the open, then we can start to contend with the long-term consequences, with the harm that they have caused. Thank you very much. Questions?